Thank you all for joining us here for the Modernizing Your Data Center with Nutanix and the Cisco UCS X-Series hardware. My name is John Gardner. I am a data center CCMP and also a CCSI. And today, what we want to do is first start with our agenda. And with that agenda, the first thing we want to talk about is what is UCSX? And also, how does it differ from traditional UCS platforms? So why is the X series better than our traditional 5108 series chassis with the B200s, M5s, for instance? Also, how are we going to integrate Nutanix hyperconverged infrastructure? How do we integrate that with the X series and also the intersite management piece? Then what I want to do is a quick demonstration on what Nutanix Prism is, how is it used to manage the system, also then what happens with our next steps. What are we going to do after we get out of this tech talk and we'd like to start taking a look at deploying Nutanix? I'll give you a little brief primer. It's to download and install foundations and get that pointed over to our X series so we can start building server profiles that will allow us to now get these Nutanix nodes in a cluster and online. So the next thing that we want to do is let's go ahead and talk about the UCS X-Series platform. In the beginning, when we had the 5108 series chassis, the main objective was to consolidate 8 compute nodes into a smaller 6 RU form factor called the 5108 series chassis. This was going to allow us to conserve and preserve rack space moving forward. Also, we wanted to be able to control the networking components for all these 8 compute nodes very simply through 2 devices called fabric interconnects. This was going to allow us to build an 8 or 10 RU system that could completely manage 8 compute nodes with applications on them and also networking requirements with some local storage. Now, that was the original 5108 series chassis. We call that our UCS. You could call it V1.0. This was the platform that started it all. We managed it with our UCS manager. This was an XML based, in the beginning it was Java based, but it eventually became XML and HTML5 based management system that would allow us to not only see our hardware components, but then apply a hardware configuration in the form of what we call a server profile. Now, this server profile, this would be configuring anything anywhere between the BIOS configuration on a per node basis, how many network interfaces we would like, or even our boot order. The server profile was there to configure the pre-OS installation hardware deployment. This allowed us to then create that server profile, apply it to the node, and we knew that it was available for an operating system and an application to be shared out across the network. Now, today, what we are looking at is our 9508 series chassis. This is, as you can see here on the slide, our new X series gear. We went from a 6RU system to a 7RU system. We still have 8 slots available for 8 compute nodes. But you will notice if you've worked with this in the past, we are moving from a horizontally installed system to a vertically installed system. We're going to see why later when we talk about GPU connectivity. Now, we do have this optic and liquid cooling tooled. That is not something that has been fully deployed as of yet, but if you are just seeing this for the first time, I want you to know, if you've already purchased the X series gear, please note, it is already ready already. So you do not need to buy any new gear as far as the chassis or the compute nodes. Now, there may be some XFM or cross-fabric modules that you need to purchase, but that's only expanding the capability and functionality of this chassis. Otherwise, it is optic and liquid cooling ready. Speaking of cooling, we went from 4 2500 watt power supplies to now 6 2800 watt power supplies, from 12 volt distribution to 54 volt distribution. And we had 8 120 millimeter dual rotor fans. We only have 4 100 millimeter dual rotor fans. Now, what I want to introduce to you is something very mind-blowing, as I like to say. Notice here, it looks like I'm using a lot more power and a lot less cooling. You know what's ironic? This system provides 1.7 times the cooling at 30% less power. So how is it that we're using higher level power components and less fans? Actually, the first thing is the power. We are pushing more power, but a lot less. We're using the power system 30% less than we were in the 5108 chassis because I don't have 4 100 millimeter dual rotor fans. I actually have 22 system fans. You're going to see the main system fans right here, the 4 main system fans. Then each one of these line cards has 3. And the power supplies, the line cards and the power supplies all come with 40 millimeter dual rotor fans. So I'm looking at way more fans. I may be using more power, but I'm using it way less. So this translates to 1.7 times the effective cooling, or from 570 CFMs to 1,000 CFMs at 30% less power. That is absolutely phenomenal. Now, when it comes to the fabric, or in other words, our network gear, we are looking here at those top Ethernet fabrics, these two right here, these modules. Those are doing the exact same thing as the input-output modules. Previously, the input-output modules were simply there to allow the compute nodes to access the network components such as the fabric interconnects. Now, these modules are doing the exact same thing, so we do not have to worry about learning anything new. You're going to plug them in the same way, they're used the same way. So if you're familiar with the UCS system, those Ethernet fabric modules operate the same way. Now, if you are familiar with, let's say, a 7000 or a 7700 series Nexus switch, we have these things called fabric modules. It allows the line cards to talk at a higher rate of transfer. In the X-Series gear, we have what is called the cross fabric modules. Those are the 2 modules down at the bottom. You'll notice that there's no ports because they're acting like a fabric module, right? It allows us to expand the capability of these nodes. So for instance, I can add more storage and more GPU by connecting slot 1 to slot 2 and putting a new module in there, such as an X440P node. I can put in GPUs in slot number 2. Now slot 1, utilizing the cross fabric module, can communicate over slot number 2 and have up to, let's say, 2 H100 GPUs. That is absolutely phenomenal. Another thing that I do want to mention is we don't talk about it here on the slide, but we do clearly have 6, and let me turn on my pointer option here. I have 6 storage devices. That could be SAS, SATA, or NVMe. We're going to be targeting NVMe today, the non-volatile version. And the reason being is because Nutanix really likes NVMe's in a JBOD. We'll talk about that later. Moving forward here, one of the things about the X-Series is that we have completely removed everything from inside this chassis. That means that we have straight up just a ton of empty space inside. That is going to reduce the airflow restrictions. This is also going to maximize the power efficiency, which is allowing us to get to 30% less power at 1.7 times the effective cooling. But the 2 biggest things are those 2 things on the outside: preventing technology lock-in and configuring as needed for workloads. So what are we talking about here? If I have a standard Generation 4 X-Series gear that came out in 2020, which was the original version of the hardware, I can seamlessly move to the Generation 5 update and to our M7s without having to replace any components except for that specific device. So if I wanted to upgrade from an M6 to an M7, I slide out the M6 and I pop in an M7. It's still going to be utilizing the same networking architecture on the background back side of the chassis. It is also going to be utilizing the same cross fabric modules, right? So it still has GPU connectivity. So we are not removing any functionality by moving to a different architecture. We can prevent technology lock-in so that this device, this chassis, can be used over and over and over. And I like to say it is forwards and backwards compatible infinitely. I love that. Which allows us to configure this system as needed for the workloads. That means that if you need to upgrade from a 25 gig infrastructure to a 100 gig infrastructure, just pop out the 25 gig IFMs in the back, or your input output modules, and slap in 100 gig. There you go. Piece of cake. So the beauty is that this can, on a very serious note, this can assist with your return on investment very, very rapidly. And as the application evolves, so will this chassis. So will the equipment inside of this chassis. One of the biggest things that I wanted to note here, this is actually, so our S410M7 4S node, this is a two-node system. And what it is doing for us is it is allowing us to put GPUs in that second slot that looks like a vent. Yeah, we can put GPUs in there. It is supporting the Intel 4th Gen Xeon processors. Absolutely. We've got 4 of them. We have 2 PCI nodes. This is post first customer shipment, so it allows us to connect PCI Express nodes, or in other words, GPUs, in slot number 2, or moving forward, memory and drive nodes, hard drives. We've got 64 DDR5 4800 DIMMs. We are also supporting up to 200 gig per compute node. By the way, this is a very standard thing. That is at the end of the day, we are always using 200 gig, right? We always want 200 gig aggregate per compute node. This is if you're using both fabric modules, the IOMs, and you're using the correct VICs and MLOMs. You will need the 5th gen VIC, which is the 15231. That said, we have a ton of drive supports, and now we've updated from an M.2 SSD to M.2 NVMe drives. So those can be used for a secondary, tertiary, or even a primary OS installation on this hardware node. Now, that said, here's your X210CM7. This is really the one that we want to focus on today because this is the start of the Nutanix support. So, what we're seeing, again, 2 Intel 4th Gen Xeon processors, Sapphire Rapids. Then we have, again, DDR5 4800, 32 DIMMs there, supporting PCI GPUs in the front of this device. By the way, the 410 4S does also support it. Then we have our cross-fabric module connection. That is going to be for networking. Again, we're looking at 200 gig aggregate on the compute node. The biggest thing here is that front side can be drives, as you can see down at the bottom here, or we've got 6 drives, where we support SAS, SATA, and NVMe, or they can be 2 GPUs. Very cool stuff. By the way, we do have this device right here. Notice that the front end looks different. That's because down at the bottom, those are 2 NVMe drives. This is called the GPU Front Mes, or GPU FM, and it supports 2 NVMe drives and 2 NVIDIA T4 GPUs. So you're getting kind of the best of both worlds, not super high level storage, super high level GPU, but we've got enough storage and GPU to get started, right? With a little bit of artificial intelligence or virtualization, right? That said, this is your takeaway. So screen cap it if you'd like. But this is kind of the comparison matrix between the M5, M6s on the B200 with the old system, the 5108 chassis, and the X210C M6, M7s, which are the standard offerings for your UCS X-Series deployments, right? So this is for you guys and girls to check out. And, if anybody ever asks you what advantage am I getting between the M6 B200 and the M6 X210, they're using the same cores, they're using the same RAM, but what are we getting? Drives, CPU, GPU, drives, and networking. Considerably higher level. That said, let's keep moving forward here. Now, how are we going to integrate Nutanix into our X series? Now, here's what we're going to say first. Cisco has developed a node, the M7 node, with what's called a Nutanix personality. In other words, the X series system can tell the difference between an X210C node and a Nutanix node. And that's going to be important, especially when we go to update the firmware on one of these nodes. It's probably going to say, hey, this is a Nutanix personality. You should probably do that through the Prism Lifecycle Manager and not through Intersight. And that right there is what we're going to be doing, folks. We're going to take a look at integrating Intersight with Prism and Prism with Intersight. Really, since this is a Cisco-driven deployment, we're going to bring Prism into our Cisco Intersight dashboard. The first thing that we want to do is let's take a look at the installation overview and what's needed to get Nutanix Prism with Foundation Central integrated into our X series. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to rack and stack our servers and fabric interconnects. So that's the 9508 series chassis with your 210M7s, which is the minimum requirement right now. Please keep that in mind. The M6s, I'm sure there's some post-first customer shipment. Wouldn't even mess with that. Let's go with the M7. Then you're going to configure the fabric interconnects. What we're doing is we're configuring the fabric interconnects for Intersight managed mode. In Intersight managed mode, we can then attach to these FIs and manage them remotely through the Intersight dashboard. We call this claiming the fabric interconnects in our fabric dashboard. Now, Intersight dashboard. Now, what we will need to do is configure those FIs. So you can configure, for instance, excuse me, we can configure organizations, resource groups, domains, and all of that. But what you're really going to need to do is configure your domain profile in Intersight and deploy it to the fabric interconnects. This is where you're now going to start seeing all of your fabric interconnects interfaces online, but more importantly, anything that's attached to them, like your 9508 series chassis with your X210CM7 nodes. That's where we're really going to start taking a look at the Nutanix to Intersight configuration. So as you can see here, that brings us to our Cisco Intersight API keys. What you'll do is you need to generate an API key that is going to be used in Prism to be able to access back and forth between Prism and Intersight. Please keep in mind that Prism Central and Foundation Central, these are Nutanix applications. So what we're doing is we're using this Intersight key to talk to Prism Central. Prism Central is the main management suite for Nutanix and, more importantly, Nutanix clustering. Now, the other piece is Foundation Central. What we need to do is we need to authenticate Foundation Central on Intersight and then use Foundations to be able to deploy a server profile in an automated fashion to your X210 M7s. So that brings us here from the authenticating Foundations to onboarding the servers with Foundations. What that is going to do is when we onboard them, we will be able to see those devices, and now we can run the cluster installation wizard through Foundation Central. At that point, I can uninstall Foundations, I can get rid of it if I want to, if I'm never going to do anything else with the deployment of Foundations. If I'm just trying to build one cluster and call it a day, you don't need Foundations ever again. Now, to be fair, if you would like to add the cluster, remove from cluster, right, Foundations is what we're going to be using. Prism is the next step. Now, we're going to point the Prism full management suite that allows me to manage clusters, drives, IOPS, C, monitoring and automation, and integrate with your inner site. That's what Prism is. So we're going to now register the cluster, your Nutanix cluster that Foundation's just created, with your Prism appliance. At that point, there's one last thing. You can go to Prism. There is an application marketplace that you can simply grab the application intersite and simply install, or excuse me, you can claim the Prism appliance using intersite managed mode. So now the Prism Central device acts like it's essentially a Cisco device that we can claim, and manage, and monitor inside of our intersite dashboard. Very neat stuff there. Now, that being said, the next thing that we're going to do is a Nutanix test drive, and you all can go there also, pause, and just go to cloud.nutanixtestdrive.com/login. I'm actually just going to keep rolling on. What I've done is I brought that up here. Whenever you do get here, you're going to want to go to modernize your data center. And so you would click connect to the test drive. What this is going to do is this is going to bring you to a fully managed environment that's already built. By the way, I do need to allow, there we go. We'll try that again. You will need to allow the pop-up from Nutanix, the nutanixtestdrive.com, and it will, as you see, bring up your Nutanix test drive. Now I'm going to just go ahead and open this up, and the first thing it's going to be asking you, and let's go ahead and resize this here really quick. And so now, the right tools turn frustration to delight. These are all of the things that they have in this demonstration. So I'm just going to say I like creating virtual machines, and it will show you how to build that virtual machine. So we can click here, and we can even go to networking and storage, compute, so on and so forth. The first thing I want to do is start with the dashboard. The dashboard is going to give us all the alerts. It is going to show us what cluster is running, what the usage is, any sort of latency, 0 milliseconds, I like that. Memory and CPU utilization. More importantly for us storage people, IOPS, right? The other thing is that we can turn on data protection, and we can also enable security. The other thing is you can move these around, so now tasks is the last thing you see. You can see any active tasks that are running. You can in real time. You can also reactively see that. Now, this is our main dashboard. If I go to compute, there's our virtual machines. When I click on compute, I can see that I can create a virtual machine utilizing the cluster that we just created. Now, there's a bunch of things here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but storage. We have what's called a storage pool. That's our physical drives for storage. And then we essentially peel back or slice up our storage pool into multiple storage containers. That is what the actual VMs are going to be using. So these are our containers that we're using. And so Nutanix Management Share, I can click on here and I can see what VMs are using them, right? Storage usage, for instance. And I can see all the usage information. So is replication or inline deduplication and compression enabled? Absolutely. Just real quick, in networking and security, we're going to use this to build things like virtual networks or subnets, which sometimes we call VLANs. Data protection. This is enabling things like recovery groups and VM recovery points like golden images. Hardware, we can see the physical hardware such as our hosts that are currently active, and this is where you would actually see your devices. This is where you would see your X210CM7s. You can also see disks. You can also see GPUs and network interfaces. Activity, operations, and administration, not super important for this test drive. But you have the test drive link. I would highly advise, if you get some time today, go ahead and take a look at our test drive. It allows you to modify any of this. If you want to break it, break it. You can go back in and reset it and start all over, right? So it's just a really great way to get used to our Nutanix environment. And so now, what is the next steps? The next steps for deploying Nutanix on your X series, you definitely want to take a look at Prism Central. This is going to be your overarching management suite. As you can see here, we can use or we can deploy it as a virtual machine or a VM cluster, so we don't have to worry about Prism Central ever going offline. It's a central management plane. It's used for managing all Nutanix clusters. We also have this thing called Prism Element, interfaces with Prism Element on the clusters. Folks, you're probably familiar with vCenter and vSphere for ESXi and VMware. That is exactly the same case here. You have Prism Central as the overarching appliance, and Prism Element that lives on the individual nodes. Yes, you can manage through Prism Element, but isn't it easier to manage through vCenter? Just like it's easier to manage through Prism Central. Last thing here is we've got operations like automation, orchestration, governance, and reporting, all standard stuff for a management suite. Now, this can be deployed as a standalone or as a cluster, as I mentioned, in 1, 3, and 5 node clusters. Please keep in mind that we do not support the 4 and 6 because of a replication factor, right? So we're replicating the configuration, synchronizing our Prism config, and we usually need 1 to 2 parity bits or parities to validate configuration if we do lose a node. Again, it is going to use an API or a REST, representative state transfer application programmable interface, to connect from Prism Central to our Prism Element devices. The next thing here is you do have operational integration for single sign-on and LDAP integration for authentication. Absolutely. Now, with that being said, the next thing is we need to talk about foundations. So foundations, first thing you're going to do is define a cluster profile. That cluster profile can be used over and over and over. In foundations, you're then going to assign the IPs to your network or to your X210CM7s, right? And then select the hypervisor and the Acropolis operating system. By the way, yes, you can install ESXi through this. Please don't. Clearly, we want to be able to install the Acropolis hypervisor and the Acropolis operating system here. Very, very important. And then what you'll do is you'll click Finish, and you will initiate the provisioning of a service profile on your X series, and then it will initiate creating the cluster after it's installed the hypervisor and the Acropolis operating system. So this is allowing us at the end of the day to do the full provisioning essentially in a 4-click method. I think that's absolutely phenomenal. By the way, you can monitor the progress in real time through Prism Central. By the way, there's a couple of different foundations options there, but your best option is to do Foundations Central using the Prism Central appliance. By the way, we do have a portable foundations, which is just a standard Microsoft system installer, an MSI. You can extract it onto a Windows 11 workstation, and as long as it has connectivity, network connectivity out to your compute nodes, it can provision AOS, AHV, server profile, and build the cluster for you. All of this happens in the time it takes you to get back from lunch. And then you come back to a cluster. I love that. And so With that being said, the true next step here, folks, is we want you to take a look at one of our other offerings here. We are actually in development process of the Hyperfabric Workshop. If you're not familiar with Hyperfabric, it is not Hyperflex. It is Hyperfabric. I'm deploying and creating real-world hands-on labs, real-world deployment scenarios. I am designing this for data center engineers, system engineers, anybody who installs any sort of small to medium-sized fabric. This is not for large-scale, 16 spine, 128 leaf networks. But this is something where we can use Cisco Blueprint to build a bill of materials for us and use Hyperfabric integration, very similar to the Meraki dashboard deployments of APs. Now you're just deploying a network with Hyperfabric instead. With that being said, folks, register now. And with that said, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your patience. Have a great day. And don't forget to contact us here at sunsetlearning.com. Thank you all very much.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.